I Should Have Been at Work. Written and read by Lynam. I was born on the 17th of September 1942 in the town of Ennis, in County Clare, Ireland. For the privilege of being born in the country of my heritage, I am indebted to one Adolf Hitler. My mother and father had both left their homeland before the Second World War to forge careers in nursing in England, where they'd met. Unemployment was rife in Ireland at the time, and like many before and after them, my parents had become economic migrants when still in their teenage years. They'd begun their training in Bournemouth, but had moved to Brighton in Sussex, where my father had become a senior mental health nurse at the Brighton General Hospital, and my mother a nursing sister. But in 1941 my father was called up by the British Army and joined the Royal Army Medical Corps. Initially he was posted to Northern Ireland, and so my mother decided to go back to the bosom of her family in Ennis so they could continue to see each other from time to time. Shortly after my mother found that she was expecting yours truly, Dad was posted to the Far East. I would not meet him until I was nearly 4 years old. Mother, Gertrude Veronica, was from a large family, 8 children in all, of which she was the youngest. Her father, and my grandfather, Parko Malone, was a famous local sportsman when a young man, excelling in the Gaelic sports of football and hurling, representing the county at both. He was well over 6 feet tall and as strong as an ox. Of all his grandchildren, I'm the only one to match him in terms of height, and also seem to have inherited his rather large conch as well. On his 40th birthday, he'd suffered an almighty hangover, subsequently took the pledge, and never did a drop of alcohol pass his lips for the next half a century. My maternal grandmother, Hannah, known as Annie, was a beauty when she was young. She rose early to go to Mass every day of the week. Parko went to church on Sundays, but each night of his life he could be seen kneeling on a chair in the living room of the tiny house in which he brought up his large family to say his prayers. His duty, he called it. They had absolute faith in the Catholic Church and their God, and gave enormous respect to the clergy. The house did not boast a bathroom. A tin bath was kept for the purpose of the occasional full-body ablution, with the water boiled in large kettles on the turf-fired range. The toilet was outside in the backyard. There was no refrigerator, no telephone. People would arrive at the door to book their horse in for a shoeing, or simply turn up to the forge. My grandfather was a farrier, a blacksmith, with his own business. In the 40s and 50s in the west of Ireland, deliveries were made by horse and cart. The pony and trap was still used by many for their personal journeys. Donkey carts were prevalent too, so business was brisk. My earliest years were spent in a home full of warmth, fun, and security. The house was in the town centre, opposite the Friary Church, handy for my grandmother. There were always visitors, aunts, uncles, cousins, neighbours, calling. I was too young to be aware of the horrors happening all over Europe, the bombing, the Holocaust, the terrible suffering. Ireland was a haven of tranquility, having declared its neutrality under President de Valera. My mother kept mentioning this fantasy figure called Daddy. I could not quite imagine who or what he was. Then one day a good-looking man in a grey pinstripe suit and a trilby hat arrived at the door, picked me up, and kissed me on the cheek. I cried my eyes out. Not so long after there was another interloper when my sister Anne was born. She'd been delivered by an angel to my mother in hospital, a story I bought without further question. This new person was taking up a vast amount of my mother's time and interest, and my grandmother had to take me to one side and explain that Mummy certainly loved me the best, but because Anne was so small, she needed to be specially looked after. But the looking after wasn't enough to save her young life. Within 6 or 7 weeks of her birth, she died of meningitis. While I remember my baby sister arriving, I have no clear memory of her death, or that it affected me very much at the time. Obviously, my mother and father were distraught at the loss. Soon afterwards they decided to take up their jobs in England again, and I found myself on the train to Limerick and Dublin, and then the mailboat crossing from Dunleary to Holly.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?